Here's a headline for you. Churches protest food banks. Whoa, ain't that a kick in the head? Churches protest food banks? That's likely not a headline you're to see in the Oregonian or even in the New York Times. But if we were living in Great Britain over the last few years, you might well have seen such a headline, or at least something akin to it. For that's exactly what some English and Scottish churches and church leaders have been doing, protesting the proliferation of food banks. Now, it's not what you might think. It's not that these members of the ecclesiastical establishment have turned a cold heart towards the poor and hungry. Quite to the contrary. They're taking a stand on behalf of the poor and the hungry against government policy. For you see, until recently, food banks did not have any appreciable foothold in the UK. Because of the country's publicly funded safety net, food banks were largely unnecessary. A livable government check was mailed regularly to even the most needy so that they could shop for themselves and not be wholly dependent upon charity. The assumption behind government support was that to live in a commonwealth was to bear a general moral obligation for the common welfare of all its citizens, even, one might say especially, the weakest and most vulnerable among them. The very young and very old, the mentally and physically disabled, and those whom a changing economy had chewed up and spit out. But Parliament, confronted with budgetary shortfalls, defaulted to cutback mode and, as usually happens in such cases, the programs they first led to the chopping block were those that served the ones whom poverty prevented from giving large donations to politicians. Opposition leaders, of course, protested the injustice of these cutbacks, but these programs feed people, they said. We can't just let people go hungry. They will not go hungry, the budget cutters calmly assured. Others will rise to meet their needs. There will be food banks. Neighbor will help neighbor, and enough will be collected to feed them all. One might hope that that would be true. But here was the problem, as far as the opposition and the churches saw it. This was the first time that private charities were being proposed for carrying the prime responsibility for the poor as a matter of public policy. It was an implicit declaration that Britain as a people was no longer going to care for the weakest and most vulnerable among them. And what would happen if the needy found that their friends and neighbors didn't in fact rally enough to go to their private cupboards and feed them? Well, that really wasn't the public's concern anymore. Goodbye, social welfare. Welcome back, Scrooge. As the churches saw it, not only was this an offense to Christian sensibilities, how could Christians in good conscience pretend the poor and needy were not their concern? It also constituted a fundamental redefinition of the British character. In one eye-opening comment, one church leader said, "We don't want to become America of all things. That's where the poor rely on food banks, and everyone just takes it for granted that that's the way it should be." Ouch. That stings. I have to admit that until I had read about the British controversy, I myself had never really thought about what the prevalence of food banks means in our culture. It is an easy way of thinking that we've so fallen to. We've never questioned it. That there are the well-to-do who enjoy catered meals most every day of the week, versus those like me who can afford a fine meal once in a while. versus those below me, to whom dining out means merely just a choice between McDonald's and Taco Bell, versus, finally, those who are really poor, who are only kept from hunger because they get a can of green beans or a cranberry sauce by standing in a food line. What an irony that the country that gave us upstairs, downstairs, and Downton Abbey should criticize us for our class system. But isn't it so that for many of us, so much of the time, the poor merely remain an afterthought? Food banks are what we give our spare change. I believe it is my tendency as an American to take the poor for granted, and I work with the poor. I do live with the unexamined assumption that the poor will always be there. And with that assumption being unexamined, I'm not spurred much to question why that should be so, let alone to do very much about it. Today is the last Sunday of the church year, what has traditionally been called Christ the King Sunday, the Feast of Christ the King. And while the gospel for today might sound like it would be more properly assigned to Holy Week, Jesus' audience before Pontius Pilate, it brings the full meaning of this day into focus. The tableau of Jesus before Pilate presents us with a study in the contrast of power. Pilate believes that he is the one who has everything in his control. On a whim, he could mobilize an army, condemn anyone he desired to the whip or to the dungeon, or indeed separate the poor from the fruits of their labor by a simple decree. Before him stands Jesus, the poor peasant prophet whom he has amusedly heard called a king by those in the countryside. But something happens as Pilate queries Jesus. Jesus performs a sort of verbal jujitsu on him. Whereas Pilate would like to joust with Jesus on the notion of kingship, Jesus has no interest in addressing the truth of power. Jesus, rather, wants to talk about the power of truth. Truth, Pilate wonders, what does power have to do with truth? And if our morning's gospel passage extended but one more verse, we'd actually hear Pilate saying, "What is truth?" But exactly Jesus' point. Pilate, in his palace position, has no idea what real truth is. By having gone for power, Pilate gave up that search long ago. If there's a climb to the top, that presumes that there are others he had climbed over to leave at the bottom. But Jesus wants us to know, just as there are basic truths defining the physical universe, such as water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, that thus there's nothing faster than the speed of light, there are also basic truths to the moral universe. And perhaps the most basic of these truths is, to paraphrase Shakespeare's Shylock, hath we all not eyes? Hath we not all organs, dimensions, senses, affections, passions? Are we not all fed with the same food, hurt with the same weapons, subject to the same diseases, healed by the same means, warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer? If you prick us, do we not all bleed? If you tickle us, do we not all laugh? If you poison us, do we not all die? Or to state it more simply, as my old mentor at Yale, William Sloane Coffin, was fond of doing, the most fundamental truth to the moral universe is we are not called upon to achieve the brotherhood of man. We are only called upon to recognize it. Yet Coffin would also go on to say, truth is always in danger of being sacrificed on the altars of good taste and social stability. It's almost a given that to get caught up in a drive for power and the vestiges that come with it, wealth, prestige, fame, such truth will be left a beggar at the gates. Early on, its cries for our attention might still retain a habit of pricking our consciences. As time goes on and we find its cries becoming fainter and fainter to the point of our losing our awareness of them altogether, it finally opens us to finally surrendering to what we, at a younger, simpler time, would have counted both abhorrent and unconscionable. Kingship, Jesus responds to Pilate. You want to talk about kingship? My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over. But because my kingdom is not from this world, my followers' fight is of a different nature. Their fight is to see that compassion is served and justice is done. Their fight is to see that all humanity is honored and cared for. And always, always, their fight is the constant fight of keeping their awareness keen and never succumbing to the unconscionable, never taking anyone's suffering for granted, but in all times and in all things to embrace and embody the grace of their King. Today is Christ the King Sunday, the feast of Christ the King. That could sound like such triumphalist swagger. Christ the King! But people make their choices. And the Pilate we see this morning would bring Jesus out before the crowds of his time and ask, would you crucify your king? They declared, we have no king but Caesar. There was certainly no triumph there. And there will only be triumph in our own time if we hold to this final moral truth, that Christ as King is also something we are not called upon to achieve, but merely as that which we are to recognize as our